Private equity people often talk about top quartile. What does it mean?
Well, it's very simple. Top quartile means being part of the best 25% of every population. So in private equity fund managers always refer to themselves as being top quartile, and they mean by this that they consider their own fund's performance to be part of the best 25% of all funds in a given population.
Okay, so how do you then explain, there's a joke common amongst private equity practitioners that actually 75% of the funds are top quartile?
Well, that was indeed puzzling for everybody who knows a little bit about statistics, because clearly if the top quartile is defined as being 25%, there's no way more than 25%, especially not 3/4 of all the population can be top quartile. So something has to be wrong there.
Okay, so what then are the more serious implications actually of this joke?
Well, you have to look a little bit more in detail in how private equity benchmarking is done and how people are using the benchmarks as reference points to explain what's lying behind this joke. And private equity benchmarking is often done based on so-called vintage year quartiles. So you look at the distribution of returns of funds that were created, that were raised in one particular calendar year, and then you cut those funds based on their performance into the famous performance quartiles. This is a very plausible approach. However, one of the problems comes from the fact that there are competing benchmark providers who are giving statistics about where the cutoff point for the famous top quartile may lie. Again, not a problem per se with having different benchmark vendors. However, the problem in private equity is that data access is so difficult that the quality of the data leads to the fact that these benchmark vendors do not necessarily agree on where the top quartile cutoff lies for any given vintage year. Now, there are also different vendors of, say, stock market indices that capture the European stock market. But if you look at what they say over time, all these indicators are strongly correlated. In private equity, you observe drastic differences between the leading benchmark statistic vendors about where the top quartile cutoff lies in a given vintage year. Now, if you imagine different fund managers who can, of course, somehow select against which benchmark they would like to be compared, they can easily find one according to which it's a little easier in a given vintage year to be in the top quartile. We wanted to explore empirically what's behind that old joke about the 75% being in the top quartile. We took a sample, a representative sample of 500 funds and their cash flows from the HEC research database, and we looked how these funds would appear against this top quartile criterion in different benchmark statistics. Surprisingly, we found that over 67%, more than 2/3, indeed can claim top quartile status by just picking the benchmark that lets them appear to be most advantageous. So we're almost there with the old joke, but there's an additional trick in top quartile according to the vintage year, because different benchmark vendors and different practitioners in private equity may also disagree in what characterizes a vintage year. This is not a legally exactly defined term. Sometimes people consider the vintage year to be the year at which a fund has a first or final closing in the fundraise. Sometimes people say the vintage year is defined by the first investment cash flow out of this fund. This can actually happen in different vintage years and different calendar years for the very same fund. So sometimes funds may, in theory, have additional flexibility in how to define the vintage year and hence fall into different calendar years. Now, in the simulation I mentioned before, if we add this flexibility and allow our fund manager not only to pick the preferred data vendor in terms of benchmarks, but also to eventually push a fund into an adjacent vintage year, then we find indeed 76% of all fund managers to be somewhere in a top quartile. Well, this brings good and bad news about private equity. The good news is that nobody's necessarily lying if they all say they're top quartile. The bad news is that with the existing way of benchmarking, the top quartile aspect as such becomes almost meaningless. Because if everybody finds some way to look top quartile, investors have no guidance as to where they should meaningfully put their money.